Let me hit you with something uncomfortable right out of the gate. If people suddenly go quiet when you speak, if they over-explain themselves around you, if they admire you but rarely relax near you, you might think you're just confident, grounded, self-aware. But here's the truth most people never tell you. You may be intimidating people without realizing it. Not because you're loud, not because you're arrogant, but because your presence carries weight. And today, I want to walk you through 8 signs that your energy, your boundaries, your emotional clarity are quietly unsettling people who are not ready to meet themselves. Let's start with the first one. Sign number 1, you don't need approval. And people feel that immediately. You don't fish for validation. You don't adjust your truth to make the room more comfortable. You listen, you speak, and you move on. And for emotionally insecure people, that feels terrifying because they're used to managing reactions. They're used to controlling how others see them. They're used to approval being the currency of connection. But you don't beg to be liked. You don't shrink to belong. You don't explain yourself when you know your intention is clean. That kind of self-trust is rare, and rare things disrupt fragile systems. So people project stories onto you. They assume you're judging them. When you're not, they assume you're distant. When you're simply grounded, your calm exposes their chaos. Your certainty reflects their doubt. And that's not a flaw in you. That's a mirror they didn't ask to look into. Sign number 2, you're comfortable with silence, and that unnerves people. You don't rush to fill the space. You don't panic when conversations pause. You let silence breathe. And most people cannot stand that because silence isn't empty. Silence is revealing. In silence, people hear their own thoughts. They feel their insecurities rise. They become aware of what they've been avoiding. But you stay present. Your body doesn't fidget. Your voice doesn't scramble for safety. You listen deeply, not to respond, not to perform, but to understand. And that level of presence can feel like pressure to someone who's used to noise as armor. They start talking more, over-explaining, justifying things you never questioned, not because you demanded answers, but because your stillness asked a question they weren't ready to answer. Silence from you doesn't mean disinterest. It means discernment. But insecure people mistake discernment for judgment. They think, what are you thinking? Why aren't you reacting? Did I say something wrong? No. You're just not leaking energy. You don't perform comfort. You don't rescue people from their discomfort. You don't smooth over truth to keep things light. And here's the hard truth. People who rely on chaos for connection will feel threatened by your calm, because calm doesn't chase. Calm doesn't explain itself. Calm doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. Your silence holds a mirror, and not everyone wants to see themselves that clearly. Sign number 3, you ask honest questions, and you don't flinch at the answers. You don't ask questions to sound smart. You don't ask to trap people. You ask because you're genuinely curious and emotionally capable of hearing the truth. And that alone can make people nervous, because most people don't want to be seen. They want to be approved. When you ask, why does this matter to you? What are you afraid of losing? What part of this feels unresolved? You're not interrogating. You're inviting depth. But depth is dangerous for people who survive on the surface. They're used to small talk, safe scripts, conversations that never touch the real wound. And you gently, calmly, without drama, go straight to the center. You don't react defensively when someone tells the truth. You don't collapse when emotions show up. You don't rush to fix or rescue. That emotional steadiness sends a message: I can hold complexity. And for someone who's still overwhelmed by their own inner world, that feels like exposure. They start editing themselves around you. They choose their words carefully. They worry you'll see something they've been hiding, not because you're cruel, but because you're clear. You don't weaponize truth, but you don't avoid it either. And that combination, compassion with courage, is deeply unsettling to people who confuse honesty with danger. Your questions aren't sharp. They're precise. And precision reveals what vagueness protects. That's not intimidation by force. That's intimidation by presence. Sign number 4, you set boundaries without making a speech about them. You don't over-explain. You don't justify. You don't apologize for protecting your time, your energy, your values. You simply say no, or you say yes intentionally, and then you follow through, and that shakes people, because most people are used to boundaries that come with guilt, chaos, or resentment. They expect drama, they expect emotional negotiations, but you're calm, clear, consistent. There's no crack to push through, no emotional loophole to exploit. And for someone who's learned to access others through pressure, persuasion, or pity, your clarity feels like rejection. They think you're cold. They label you too much or too distant. But what they're really reacting to is this: you don't abandon yourself to keep the peace. Your boundaries don't punish, they protect. And protection is threatening to people who benefit from your exhaustion. You don't say yes and then resent it. You don't agree and then complain later. You don't leak frustration in passive ways. That kind of emotional integrity is rare. It forces others to confront how often they say yes when they mean no, how often they manipulate instead of asking directly, how often they cross lines and call it closeness. Your boundary isn't loud, but it's firm, and firmness without anger feels intimidating to people who only understand power through conflict. You don't raise your voice, you raise the standard, and not everyone is willing or able to meet it. Sign number 5, you are emotionally self-sufficient. And you don't outsource your worth. You enjoy connection, but you don't need it to feel whole. You appreciate praise, but you don't depend on it to know who you are. You welcome love, but you don't beg for it. And that independence can feel threatening, because many people build their sense of value through others, through attention, validation, reactions, reassurance. But you've done the work, you've sat with yourself in discomfort, you've faced your own shadows, you've learned how to self-soothe instead of self-abandon. So when someone pulls away, you don't chase. When approval disappears, you don't crumble. When expectations aren't met, you don't panic, you stay anchored. And that makes people uneasy, not because you're unkind, but because you're not easily controlled. They can't manipulate you with silence. They can't hook you with crumbs of affection. They can't destabilize you with mixed signals. Your nervous system isn't reactive. It's regulated, and for people who rely on emotional chaos to feel powerful or needed, that stability feels like loss of influence. They may say you're detached. They may accuse you of not caring enough. But what they're really seeing is this: you care without clinging. You love without losing yourself. You engage without erasing your identity. That level of inner security exposes how fragile external validation really is. Your strength isn't loud, it's rooted. And rooted people don't sway for anyone. That kind of steadiness doesn't intimidate everyone, only those who've never learned how to stand on their own. Sign number 6, you don't perform emotions to make others comfortable. You don't exaggerate reactions. You don't fake enthusiasm. You don't smile to manage someone else's anxiety. What you feel is what you show, calmly, honestly, without theater. And that can feel deeply unsettling, because many people were taught that emotions are tools. Smile so they don't get upset, nod so they feel heard, react bigger so the moment feels right. But you don't do that. You don't mirror energy, you don't feel, you don't laugh to belong. You don't dramatize pain to be taken seriously. You trust your internal experience enough to let it be simple. And simplicity is threatening in a world addicted to performance. People start wondering, are they bored? Are they judging me? Why aren't they reacting the way I expected? Not because you're cold, but because you're congruent. Your inner world and outer expression match. That alignment is rare, and rare things make people question their own masks. You don't manipulate with emotion. You don't use vulnerability to gain leverage. You don't confuse intensity with intimacy. Your presence says, I don't need to convince you of anything. And for someone who relies on emotional displays to control outcomes, that feels like losing power. They can't read you the way they read others. They can't provoke a reaction to feel secure. Your emotional honesty is quiet, but unshakable. And when someone is used to noise, your truth feels deafening. Sign number 7, you don't compete. And that confuses people. You don't need to one-up anyone. You don't rush to prove you're smarter, better, or more evolved. You don't measure your worth by comparison. And in a culture obsessed with hierarchy, that feels threatening because competition is familiar. It creates roles. It tells people where they stand. But you step out of that game entirely. You celebrate others without shrinking yourself. You hold your achievements without flaunting them. You don't envy, you observe. And that neutrality unsettles people who rely on rivalry for identity. They expect jealousy, they expect insecurity, they expect a reaction. But you give none, not because you're superior, but because you're secure. You know who you are, you know what you're building, you know what matters to you. So you don't need to dominate a room to feel valuable. You don't need to be the loudest voice to feel seen. You don't need to win every conversation. And for people who confuse success with superiority, your calm confidence feels like silent judgment, even when there is none. They project motives onto you. They assume you're calculating. They think you're withholding something. But the truth is simpler. You're not competing because you're not threatened. Your presence disrupts the unspoken rules of ego. It exposes how exhausting comparison really is. And when someone has built their identity on being better than your freedom feels like rejection of the entire system. That's not arrogance. That's self-respect without rivalry. Sign number 8, you speak the truth gently, but you don't dilute it. You don't attack. You don't shame. You don't raise your voice to be heard. You say what needs to be said clearly, calmly, and without cruelty, and that is far more intimidating than aggression. Because people know how to defend against anger. They know how to dismiss drama. They know how to survive shouting. But grounded honesty, that leaves no place to hide. You don't soften your truth to protect egos. You don't wrap it in performance. You don't apologize for clarity. You choose your words carefully, and then you stand by them. For people who avoid accountability, that feels like exposure. For people who rely on confusion, that feels dangerous. For people who survive on ambiguity, that feels like threat. They may say you're too direct. They may accuse you of being intense. But what they're really reacting to is this: you're not afraid of discomfort. You trust that truth delivered with compassion is not violence. It's respect. And respect without fear is destabilizing to those who use fear to maintain control. You don't dominate conversations. You don't overpower people. You illuminate what's already there. And when the lights come on, people who were comfortable in the dark will feel exposed. Your words don't wound. They reveal. And revelation for the unprepared can feel like intimidation. You've outgrown the need to be understood. And that quietly unsettles people. You still communicate clearly. You still care deeply, but you no longer chase comprehension from people who are committed to misunderstanding you. And that shift is powerful because most people spend their lives explaining themselves, defending their choices, justifying their boundaries, begging to be seen accurately. But you stopped doing that, not because you gave up, but because you grew up, you realized something painful and freeing at the same time. Not everyone is capable of understanding you at your level of self-awareness. So when someone projects, you don't correct the story. When they misunderstand, you don't spiral. When they label you, you don't rush to rewrite the narrative. You let them keep their version. And that detachment feels threatening to people who gain power by controlling perception. They expect explanations. They expect emotional labor. They expect you to contort yourself until they feel comfortable, but you don't. You stay rooted in your truth, whether it's applauded or questioned. Your peace no longer depends on being accurately perceived, and that kind of freedom exposes how dependent others are on external validation. They wonder, Why don't they care what I think? Why aren't they trying to fix this? Because you've learned the difference between clarity and control. You speak once, honestly. After that, you let go. And for people who confuse being understood with being safe, your emotional independence feels like rejection. But it's not rejection. And self-trust, when fully embodied, can feel intimidating to anyone still asking permission to be themselves. Here's what I want you to hear. Slowly, clearly, without defensiveness. If you intimidate people without realizing it, it's not because you're harsh, cold, or superior. It's because you're whole. You've done the work most people avoid. You've learned how to sit with discomfort instead of escaping it. You've built a relationship with self that doesn't require our constant reassurance. And that kind of inner solidity changes the air in a room. People who are still negotiating their worth will feel exposed. People who rely on chaos will feel unsettled. People who benefit from blurred boundaries will feel challenged. Not because you're attacking them, but because your presence refuses to lie. You are a living reminder that clarity is possible. That calm is strength. That self-respect doesn't need permission. And here's the most important part. You don't need to make yourself smaller to be less intimidating. You don't need to soften your truth. You don't need to perform warmth. You don't need to carry the emotional comfort of others. Your job is not to be digestible. Your job is to be authentic. The right people will feel safe with you, not threatened. They'll rise instead of recoil. They'll meet you instead of shrinking. And those who feel intimidated, they're not reacting to your power. They're reacting to their own unfinished work. So stand steady, stay kind, stay clear. Because when you stop apologizing for your wholeness, you give others permission or a challenge to do the same. And either way, that is leadership.